Ezen gasped, her chest heaving. Dyke was kneeling beside her, his grip still firm on her arm. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice tense. Ezen's throat was dry. "My mother." Dyke's expression darkened. "The spirits are playing tricks on us." Ezen shivered. The spirits weren't just watching, they were testing them, searching for their weaknesses, luring them into the darkness. And if Dyke hadn't stopped her in time, she might never have come back. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Anakai exhaled. "Because it speaks. It calls to those who cross it, whispering their deepest regrets, their failures, their sins. If you listen too closely, it will take you." A chill ran down Ezen's spine. "So how do we cross?" Dyke asked, his eyes scanning the riverbanks. Anakai pointed to a narrow wooden bridge barely visible through the mist. It was old, its wood rotting and cracked, as though it had not been used in years. "We must cross one at a time," Anakai warned. "The river will try to break us. No matter what you hear, do not stop. Do not look down. And above all, do not speak to the voices." Ezen's stomach twisted. The spirits had already used her mother's voice against her. What more would they do? Anakai went first. He walked slowly, his steps firm. The moment his foot touched the bridge, the whispering grew louder. Ezen couldn't make out the words, but she saw how his shoulders tensed, how his hands gripped his staff tightly as he moved forward. Halfway across, his steps faltered. His head turned slightly, as if listening to something. Then, with great effort, he pulled himself forward. Moments later, he reached the other side. Anakai turned to them. "Next." Dyke stepped forward. Ezen watched as he walked onto the bridge. The moment he did, his body stiffened. His pace slowed. His breathing became uneven. Ezen could hear something now, faint, taunting voices. "You failed them, Dyke. You let them die. You are not strong enough to stop Obiora." Ezen clenched her fists. Dyke's hands shook, his jaw clenched as though he was fighting something only he could see. Then, with a growl, he forced himself forward. Step by step, he reached the other side. Ezen swallowed hard. Now it was her turn. She placed a foot on the bridge. The moment she did, the world tilted. And then, the whispers came. "Ezen, you could have saved us." Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. It was Adiz. The first girl who had gone missing. The one whose body they had found floating in the river weeks ago. "You let us die, Ezen. We trusted you." Ezen's legs trembled. The river below seemed to pulse, the mist rising like reaching hands. "We are waiting for you, Ezen. Come join us." She felt something cold brush against her ankle. Her head snapped down. Hands. Rotting, pale hands reaching up from the water. Her heart hammered in terror. "Do not look down." Anakai's voice cut through the whispers. Ezen squeezed her eyes shut. She forced her feet to move, pushing forward, blocking out the voices, the hands, the guilt that threatened to consume her. One step. Then another. The whispers screamed in rage, but she did not stop. And then, she was across. She collapsed onto the ground, her body shaking. Anakai and Dyke helped her up. "You did well," Anakai murmured. Ezen looked back at the river. The whispers had faded. But the spirits had left their mark. And she knew, they were far from done testing her. Ezen's chest rose and fell heavily as she sat on the damp ground, her fingers digging into the soil. The whispers had faded, but the cold touch of the spirits still lingered on her skin, like a memory that refused to leave. Dyke knelt beside her, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are you hurt?" Ezen shook her head, though she wasn't sure if she was lying. She felt different. Something inside her had shifted the moment she crossed the river. Anakai, standing just beyond them, was watching her closely. His expression unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, swallowing hard. The old man took a step forward, his weathered fingers brushing over her wrist. And then he stiffened. Ezen's breath caught in her throat as Anakai slowly turned her hand palm up. And there, etched into her skin, was a faint, glowing symbol. A mark. "The spirits have touched you," Anakai murmured, his voice grim. Ezen yanked her hand back, staring at the strange, pulsing mark. It was shaped like a coiled serpent, its mouth open in an eternal hiss. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Anakai's lips pressed into a thin line. "It means they have claimed you." Dyke stiffened. "Claimed?" Anakai's eyes darkened. She walked through the river of echoes and did not drown. The spirits tested her, and she survived. That does not mean they have let her go. Ezen's stomach churned. The mark burned faintly, like a brand seared into her very soul. "So what happens now?" she asked. Anakai sighed. "We keep moving." But Ezen could tell. He wasn't saying everything. He knew more than he was letting on. And as they stepped deeper into the cursed forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the spirits had done to her, it wasn't over. Not yet. Ezen's chest rose and fell heavily as she sat on the damp ground, her fingers digging into the soil. The whispers had faded, but the cold touch of the spirits still lingered on her skin, like a memory that refused to leave. Dyke knelt beside her, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are you hurt?" Ezen shook her head, though she wasn't sure if she was lying. She felt different. Something inside her had shifted the moment she crossed the river. Anakai, standing just beyond them, was watching her closely. His expression unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, swallowing hard. The old man took a step forward, his weathered fingers brushing over her wrist. And then he stiffened. Ezen's breath caught in her throat as Anakai slowly turned her hand palm up. And there, etched into her skin, was a faint, glowing symbol. A mark. "The spirits have touched you," Anakai murmured, his voice grim. Ezen yanked her hand back, staring at the strange, pulsing mark. It was shaped like a coiled serpent, its mouth open in an eternal hiss. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Anakai's lips pressed into a thin line. "It means they have claimed you." Dyke stiffened. "Claimed?" Anakai's eyes darkened. She walked through the river of echoes and did not drown. The spirits tested her, and she survived. That does not mean they have let her go. Ezen's stomach churned. The mark burned faintly, like a brand seared into her very soul. "So what happens now?" she asked. Anakai sighed. "We keep moving." But Ezen could tell. He wasn't saying everything. He knew more than he was letting on. And as they stepped deeper into the cursed forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the spirits had done to her, it wasn't over. Not yet. The path ahead twisted unnaturally, the trees closing in like silent watchers. The deeper they moved, the heavier Ezen felt, as if something unseen had latched onto her. The mark on her wrist throbbed, sending sharp, cold pulses through her veins. "Are you all right?" Dyke's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Ezen hesitated, then nodded. Yes. She didn't know if that was true. Anakai, who had been quiet, suddenly stopped. His gaze swept across the dense trees. His body stiffened. "They are following us." Dyke's hand went to his blade. "Who?" Anakai turned to Ezen. "Not who, what?" A shiver crawled up her spine. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the shadows. At first, there was nothing. Just trees and mist. Then, a flicker. A shape too tall, too thin, moving in the corner of her vision. Not walking but gliding. Another flicker, to the right this time. A second figure. Then a third. All of them were just barely visible, their features lost in the darkness. "What are they?" Ezen whispered. Anakai's face was grim. The spirits of the forgotten. They are drawn to you now. Ezen's breath caught. Why me? Anakai's eyes fell to the mark on her wrist. Because you carry their mark. You have crossed into their world, and they do not intend to let you leave. Dyke tensed. What do we do? Anakai exhaled slowly. We keep moving. And whatever happens, do not look them in the eyes. Ezen swallowed hard. Then, as they stepped forward, the shadows followed. Silent. Waiting. And the deeper they went, the more she felt their hungry eyes pressing against her back. The air grew colder as Ezen, Dyke, and Anakai pressed forward, the weight of unseen eyes bearing down on them. Every step felt like walking deeper into the grasp of something ancient and hungry. Ezen's pulse pounded. The mark on her wrist still burned, a dull ache spreading through her arm. The watchers, the shadowy spirits that had been following them, remained just at the edge of her vision. Never fully seen, but always there. Why do they not attack? Dyke murmured, his voice tense. Because they are waiting, Anakai said. They feed on fear, on weakness. They want us to break first. Ezen swallowed hard. She could feel them pressing in, their presence curling around her like vines, whispering just beyond her hearing. Then, one of them moved. For the first time, one of the figures stepped forward. Ezen's breath caught. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that stretched too wide. Its skin was ashen, and though it had no mouth, she swore she could hear it breathing. It lifted a hand, bony, clawed fingers reaching for her. Ezen froze. The mark on her wrist flared. The moment it did, the figure staggered back, hissing. Anakai's eyes narrowed. They cannot touch you. Ezen looked at him, her breath still shaky. Why? Anakai studied her carefully. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Because they fear what you are becoming. Ezen's stomach twisted. What she was becoming? She didn't ask what he meant. Because deep inside, she already knew, something inside her had changed. And the spirits knew it too. Ezen's heart hammered in her chest as Anakai's words settled over her like a heavy shroud. What you are becoming. She had survived the river of echoes, endured the spirits' whispers, and now, even the watchers feared her touch. But why? She looked down at the mark on her wrist, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Ezen, Dyke's voice cut through the silence. We need to move. She nodded, pushing aside her growing unease. Whatever had changed within her, there was no time to dwell on it. Obiora still lived. And as long as he did, more lives would be lost. Anakai took the lead again, guiding them through the labyrinth of trees. The forest twisted in unnatural ways, the path shifting beneath their feet. After what felt like hours, the trees suddenly parted. And before them stretched a clearing. At its center lay a massive stone altar, stained dark with old blood. Surrounding it were wooden idols, their faces carved into grotesque expressions, their eyes hollow pits of nothingness. Ezen's stomach churned. This is it, Anakai murmured. The place where Obiora performed his sacrifices. Dyke stepped forward, his jaw clenched. He's killed so many here. The air felt thick, as if the land itself remembered every scream, every drop of blood spilled. Ezen placed a hand on the altar. It was ice cold. And then. A whisper. Low. Faint. But unmistakable. Help us. Ezen's breath caught. She turned sharply, scanning the shadows. But there was nothing. Then, another whisper. Avenge us. Her blood ran cold. The spirits of the sacrificed women were still here. Trapped. Waiting. And now they had seen her. And they knew who she was. The whispers grew louder, curling around Ezen like smoke. They carried the weight of suffering, betrayal, and agony, the cries of the women Obiora had sacrificed. Avenge us. Do not let him take another. Ezin's fingers trembled as they rested on the altar. The cold stone beneath her palm felt alive, as though it pulsed with the memories of the blood spilled upon it. They are restless, Anakai murmured, his voice grim. Their pain binds them here. They will not leave until justice is done. Dyke stepped closer, scanning the darkened edges of the clearing. Then we will give them justice. His hand tightened around his blade. Where is Obiora? Anakai's eyes never left the altar. Near. He will feel our presence here. Ezin exhaled slowly, trying to steady her racing heart. She knew the spirits were watching. Waiting. But something else stirred in the air. A presence. Not just the spirits of the dead, but something older. Darker. The very power that had made Obiora untouchable all these years. She felt it press against her mind, testing her, as though recognizing her mark. And in that moment she understood. They weren't just fighting a man. They were fighting the dark forces that had kept him in power. A battle of flesh and blood was coming. But so was a battle of spirits and shadows. And if they weren't careful, Obiora wouldn't be the only one claimed by the darkness. The air in the clearing grew heavy, thick with something unseen. Ezin could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond their reach. It wasn't just the spirits of the dead crying out for justice. Something darker was watching. He knows we are here, Anakai murmured, his grip on his staff tightening. Obiora's master stirs. Ezin's stomach twisted. His master. Anakai nodded slowly. Obiora is powerful, but not because of his own strength. He serves something greater, something ancient. It is that force that keeps him untouchable. Dyke spat on the ground. Then we cut off its vessel. His voice was firm, but even he couldn't ignore the cold creeping into the air. Ezin glanced at the altar again. The voices of the sacrificed women had gone silent, as if something stronger had silenced them. A rustling came from the trees. Then another. The sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Ezin's fingers curled into fists. Then, a deep, chilling voice cut through the night. You should not have come here. Her breath hitched. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall. Wrapped in flowing black robes. His face was hidden behind a carved wooden mask, but even through it, his eyes burned with unnatural fire. Obiora. But he was not alone. Behind him, shadows slithered like living things, twisting and writhing in the air. And then, the ground trembled. A warning. This was no longer just a fight for revenge. It was a fight for their very souls. The clearing grew deathly still as Obiora stepped forward, his dark robes flowing like liquid shadow. His burning eyes settled on them, unreadable, yet filled with a quiet menace. Ezin felt her breath hitch. This was the man who had caused so much pain, so much loss. The one who had fed on the blood of the innocent to sustain his wealth and power. And yet, he did not look entirely human. The shadows behind him moved unnaturally, shifting like they had minds of their own. They clung to him, whispering things that made Ezin's mark pulse with cold fire. You came to die, Obiora said, his voice smooth, almost amused. How generous of you. Dyke unsheathed his blade. You will answer for what you've done. Obiora chuckled. It was a low, hollow sound. And what exactly have I done, warrior? Have I not given to the people? Have I not built wealth, power, and prosperity? And all it cost was a few sacrifices. Ezin gritted her teeth. 10 women. 10 lives stolen. Obiora tilted his head. 10. Oh, my dear. You do not even know the true count, asterisk. Ezin's stomach turned. The air shifted. A deep, unsettling force pressed against them, a presence much larger than Obiora himself. He is not alone, Anakai whispered, his voice edged with warning. His master is watching. Obiora smiled. Oh, the old one is wise. His gaze slid to Anakai. You know what I serve. You know it cannot be stopped. Anakai gripped his staff tighter. Everything has an end. Even demons. The shadows behind Obiora lurched forward, twisting, forming grotesque shapes with gaping mouths. Then let us see if you can stop what you do not understand. With a single flick of his hand, the shadows rushed toward them. And the battle began. The shadows rushed forward like a living tide, twisting into grotesque shapes with clawed hands and hollow eyes. The air grew thick with an unnatural cold, the weight of something far older than time itself pressing against Ezin's chest. Dyke moved first. His blade flashed, slicing through the darkness, but the shadows reformed instantly, slithering around him like snakes. They are not flesh. Anakai warned, raising his staff. Steel will not stop them. Obiora stood still, watching them with amusement, his burning eyes flickering like dying embers. This is not your fight to win, he said, his voice unnervingly calm. You have stepped onto cursed ground. And the curse do not leave unchanged. Ezin felt the mark on her wrist burn. The spirits of the women Obiora had sacrificed were still here. Waiting. Watching. She clenched her fist. No, she whispered. We are not alone. She slammed her marked hand against the blood-stained altar. The moment her skin met stone, the world trembled. A wail rose from the ground, a scream so raw and filled with agony that even the shadows recoiled. Then, they came. The spirits of the murdered women. They rose from the earth, their forms twisted by suffering, their eyes burning with vengeance. He took our lives. He stole our voices. He fed our blood to the darkness. Their whispers grew into a roar, a storm of fury aimed at the one who had destroyed them. Obiora staggered back. For the first time, his expression changed. Fear. Ezin lifted her gaze, meeting his burning eyes. They are here, Obiora. Her voice was steady. Unbreakable. And they will have their justice. The spirits let out a soul-piercing scream, and then they rushed at him. The battle was no longer just theirs. It was now a war between the living and the dead. Obiora's face twisted in horror as the spirits of his victims surged toward him, their wails shaking the night. Their forms flickered between shadow and substance, eyes burning with the pain of their stolen lives. You cannot touch me. Obiora roared, throwing out his arms. The shadows around him rose in defense, writhing like living serpents. But the spirits did not stop. They tore through the darkness, their fury greater than his cursed power. One by one, they reached him. The first spirit, a woman with long, braided hair and hollow eyes, clawed at his chest, leaving behind deep, blackened wounds. You promised me love. Her voice was filled with bitterness and sorrow. And gave me death instead. The second spirit, her skin pale and decayed, gripped his arm, twisting it unnaturally. I was to be wed, Obiora. Her whisper was cold, a blade against his soul. You stole my future. Obiora screamed as more spirits latched onto him, their cold hands draining the strength from his body. No, he bellowed, his power flaring, but it was weakening. The spirits were too many. Their anger too strong. Dyke stepped forward, his sword still drawn. This is the justice you feared, isn't it? His voice was steady, filled with the weight of all the lives lost. Ezin felt the mark on her wrist burn hotter than ever. She stepped beside Dyke, watching as the spirits dragged Obiora down. His once commanding figure shrank, his robes tattered, his face pale with terror. Anakai stood at the edge of the clearing, his staff glowing faintly. He nodded once. It is done. Obiora let out a final scream, a sound of pure, unfiltered despair, before the spirits pulled him into the altar. The earth shook violently. The blood-stained stone cracked. The shadows that had once served him vanished into the wind. And then, silence. For the first time in years the night was still. The darkness had lost its master. Obiora was no more. The clearing felt different. The air, once thick with darkness, was now light, as though an unseen weight had been lifted. The spirits had vanished, their vengeance complete, their restless souls finally at peace. Ezen, Dyke, and Anakai stood in silence, staring at the cracked altar where Obiora had been pulled into the abyss. His screams still echoed in their minds, but the night itself felt clean. Dyke exhaled slowly, lowering his blade. "It's over." His voice was quiet, almost as if he couldn't believe it. Anakai nodded but didn't look relieved. "For now." Ezen turned her wrist over, staring at the mark that had guided her through this nightmare. It still pulsed faintly, but the burning heat was gone. "What happens to the spirits now?" she asked. Anakai sighed. "They will rest, for the first time in years. But the stain of what happened here will never fully fade." They stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind, as if waiting for the night to return to normal. Then, a distant sound. A bell. Not from the clearing. From the village. Dyke's head snapped up. "That's the warning bell." Ezen's heart skipped a beat. "Something's wrong." Anakai's gaze darkened. "Then we must hurry. The battle here is done, but I fear a new one is beginning." With that, they turned away from the ruined altar, rushing back toward the village. But in the stillness of the clearing, beneath the shattered stone, something shifted. A whisper, too faint to hear. A presence, not quite gone. And in the darkness beneath the earth, something waited. Something left behind. The village bell rang out through the night, its chime sharp and urgent. Ezen's heart pounded as she, Dyke, and Anakai hurried down the narrow, moonlit path leading home. The night had been cleansed of Obiora's presence, but a new dread settled in her chest. What could it be? Dyke muttered, his grip still firm on his blade. "We will soon find out," Anakai said, his staff glowing faintly in the dark. As they neared the village, the air felt heavy again, but not with Obiora's evil. This was different. Familiar, yet wrong. When they finally reached the outskirts, they found the villagers gathered in the square, murmuring in panic. A woman knelt in the center, wailing. Beside her, a body lay still on the ground. Ezen's breath caught. It was Nena, one of the young women from the village. Her eyes were wide open, her lips parted as if frozen mid-scream. A dark mark was carved into her forehead, one Ezen had seen before. Anakai's face hardened. This is no ordinary death. Dyke knelt beside the body, touching her cold skin. She was drained, like the others. The realization hit Ezen like a slap. But Obiora is dead. The village elder, a frail but sharp-eyed man named Odafe, stepped forward. His voice was low, heavy with fear. "Then tell me," he said, "who did this?" Silence fell. Obiora was gone. But the evil he served, it was not finished. And somewhere in the darkness, it had found a new vessel. The villagers stood frozen, their gazes darting between Nena's lifeless body and Ezen, Anakai, and Dyke. Fear thickened the air, pressing down on them like an invisible hand. "This cannot be," Dyke muttered, rising to his feet. "Obiora is dead. We saw him fall." Anakai's eyes remained locked on the mark carved into Nena's forehead. His face was unreadable, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried a deep unease. "Yes, we saw Obiora fall. But we never saw what left him." Ezen's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The old seer's grip tightened on his staff. The darkness he served was never his alone. It used him, fed him power, and in return, it took the blood of his victims. But when he fell, that darkness was left behind. A chill crawled up Ezen's spine. And now it has found another. The realization spread through the crowd like a wildfire. Murmurs turned to panicked whispers and then, accusations. "Who among us has been touched by this evil?" someone cried. "How do we stop it if we don't know where it is?" Odafe, the village elder, raised a hand for silence. His weathered face was grim. We will not turn on each other in fear. We must act with wisdom. His gaze shifted to Anakai. Tell us, seer. Can this evil be stopped? Anakai hesitated. Then, his gaze darkened. Yes, he said. But first, we must find who carries it now. Ezen looked down at Nena's body once more. The wound on her forehead was fresh. Whoever, or whatever, had done this was close. Watching. Waiting. And if they didn't act fast, more blood would be spilled. The village square remained eerily silent, the weight of Nena's death pressing down on everyone. The villagers clutched their charms and muttered prayers under their breath, fear settling deep into their bones. Ezen scanned the crowd, her heartbeat quickening. If the darkness had found a new vessel, then that person was standing among them. Anakai turned to Odafe. Northwest one leaves the square, he commanded. If we let the villagers scatter, we may never find who carries this evil now. Odafe nodded, signaling to the younger men to block the exits. Dyke wiped a hand down his face, his frustration evident. How do we find the one who has been marked? If the spirit moved from Obiora, it will not make itself known easily. Anakai closed his eyes for a moment before whispering, "We listen." The villagers shifted uneasily. Listen? Then, a faint rustling. Not from the trees. Not from the wind. It came from within the crowd. Ezen's gaze snapped toward the sound. A woman, Igioma, stood near the back, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her head was lowered, her breathing shallow. Igioma. Ezen called out. She did not respond. Instead, her shoulders trembled. And then, in a voice not entirely her own, she whispered. He never left. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Dyke's hand flew to his blade, Anakai gripped his staff tighter, and Ezen felt her blood turn to ice. Igioma slowly lifted her face. Her eyes, once warm and brown, were now black. Empty. And when she smiled, it was not her own. Did you think you could bury me? She whispered. I am not so easily undone. The darkness had found its new home. Obiora's spirit lived on. A cold shudder ran through the crowd as Igioma's blackened eyes swept over them. It was not her anymore. It was something else. Something ancient. Dyke unsheathed his blade. Stand back, he warned, stepping between Igioma and the others. Ezen's throat went dry. She had seen the fear in Obiora's eyes when the spirits dragged him down. She had believed that was the end. But now, the darkness had found a new body. A new puppet. Anakai's jaw tightened. She is not fully taken, he muttered. The spirit is still settling. If we act now, we may be able to drive it out. Igioma tilted her head. The motion was unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been jerked too sharply. You think you can save her? The voice that came from her lips was Obiora's. But it was twisted, warped with something inhuman. The villagers shrank back. She let me in, Obiora's voice purred through Igioma's lips. She called out for fortune. And I answered. Ezen's heart pounded. Had Igioma, in a moment of desperation, unknowingly opened herself to the same dark forces that once fueled Obiora? Lies. Anakai snapped. He raised his staff, the carved wood glowing faintly. She was deceived, just as you once were. But you will not use her as your vessel. Igioma's lips curled into a wicked smile. Will I not? Then, she moved. Faster than anyone expected. Her hands shot forward, clawed fingers reaching for Ezen's throat. Dyke lunged. His blade sliced through the air. But Igioma, or whatever controlled her, was quicker. With an unnatural twist of her body, she dodged the strike, her movements more shadow than flesh. The villagers screamed. Ezen stumbled back, her mark flaring with heat. This was not just Obiora anymore. This was something worse. And it was ready to kill. Ijeoma lunged again, her fingers curling like claws, reaching for Ezen's throat. But before she could make contact, Anakai slammed his staff into the ground. A burst of light shot from its tip, creating a barrier between them. Ijeoma hissed, recoiling, her darkened eyes flickering with rage. She is still in there. Anakai shouted. The spirit has not fully taken her. We must act now. Dike tightened his grip on his blade, his breath heavy. How do we force it out? Anakai's gaze did not waver. We remind her of who she is. Ezen's chest tightened. Ijeoma, she called, stepping closer despite the danger. You must fight it. For a moment, just a brief moment, something shifted in Ijeoma's face. Her body tensed, her fingers twitching. Then, Obiora's voice came through her lips again. She does not wish to fight. She is mine now. The air grew heavy, thick with dark energy. The villagers were frozen in fear, some clutching charms, others murmuring prayers. But Ezen refused to back down. She took another step forward, her voice firm. Ijeoma, listen to me. Obiora was a liar, a deceiver. He used people and threw them away. You are stronger than him, stronger than this evil. Ijeoma's body trembled. Her hands clutched at her chest, her breathing ragged. For the first time, her real voice broke through. Ezen. Dike's eyes widened. She's fighting it. Anakai lifted his staff again, his voice booming with power. Obiora, your time is over. This soul is not yours to keep. The ground shook violently. Ijeoma let out a piercing scream, her body convulsing. The darkness inside her lashed out, but the light surrounding Anakai's staff grew brighter, pushing it back. Ezen reached out, grabbing Ijeoma's trembling hands. Come back to us, she pleaded. Ijeoma's body arched, her eyes rolling back. And then a great shadow burst from her mouth, shrieking. It hovered in the air, writhing in agony, its form flickering between smoke and something almost human. The villagers gasped in horror. Obiora's face took shape within the darkness, his features twisted in rage and despair. You cannot be rid of me, his voice howled. You cannot destroy what you do not understand. Anakai thrust his staff forward. Then we will send you back to where you belong. The light from his staff exploded outward. And the shadow let out a final, soul-rending scream. Before it was torn apart, scattered into the wind. The village fell into silence. Ijeoma's body collapsed. Ezen and Dike rushed to her side. Her eyes, now brown once more, fluttered open. Ezen, she whispered weakly. Tears burned in Ezen's eyes. I'm here, Ijeoma. You're safe now. The nightmare was finally over. Or so they thought. The village square remained still, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. The dark force that had lingered in Ijeoma was gone, scattered by Anakai's power. But something felt off. Ezen knelt beside Ijeoma, brushing damp hair from her face. You're safe now, she whispered again, as much to reassure herself as to comfort her friend. Ijeoma's breathing was shallow, her face pale. Dike hovered nearby, his blade still unsheathed, eyes scanning the shadows. The villagers stood in a tense circle, watching with expressions of awe, fear, and exhaustion. Anakai stepped closer, his staff glowing faintly. He peered down at Ijeoma, his face unreadable. What is it? Ezen asked, noticing his hesitation. The old seer was silent for a moment. Then, in a low voice, he said, the darkness left her, but it did not leave untouched. Ezen's chest tightened. What do you mean? Ijeoma stirred weakly. Her lips parted as if to speak, but then, she winced. Her fingers curled into the dirt, and a sharp breath escaped her. And that's when Ezen saw it. A mark. Faint but unmistakable, a thin black vein curled from the base of Igioma's throat, disappearing beneath her clothing. Ezen felt cold. Anakai. Dike leaned in, eyes darkening. That wasn't there before. Anakai's face was grim. No, it was not. Igioma's eyes fluttered open again. What happened to me? She whispered. Ezen swallowed hard. She wanted to tell her that everything was over, that the nightmare had ended. But as she looked at the blackened vein crawling up Igioma's neck, she knew the truth. The darkness had left her body. But it had not let go. And whatever it had left behind, it was still growing. The village square remained still, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. The dark force that had lingered in Igioma was gone, scattered by Anakai's power. But something felt off. Ezen knelt beside Igioma, brushing damp hair from her face. You're safe now, she whispered again, as much to reassure herself as to comfort her friend. Igioma's breathing was shallow, her face pale. Dike hovered nearby, his blade still unsheathed, eyes scanning the shadows. The villagers stood in a tense circle, watching with expressions of awe, fear, and exhaustion. Anakai stepped closer, his staff glowing faintly. He peered down at Igioma, his face unreadable. What is it? Ezen asked, noticing his hesitation. The old seer was silent for a moment. Then, in a low voice, he said, the darkness left her, but it did not leave untouched. Ezen's chest tightened. What do you mean? Igioma stirred weakly. Her lips parted as if to speak, but then, she winced. Her fingers curled into the dirt, and a sharp breath escaped her. And that's when Ezen saw it. A mark. Faint but unmistakable, a thin black vein curled from the base of Igioma's throat, disappearing beneath her clothing. Ezen felt cold. Anakai. Dike leaned in, eyes darkening. That wasn't there before. Anakai's face was grim. No, it was not. Igioma's eyes fluttered open again. What happened to me? She whispered. Ezen swallowed hard. She wanted to tell her that everything was over, that the nightmare had ended. But as she looked at the blackened vein crawling up Igioma's neck, she knew the truth. The darkness had left her body. But it had not let go. And whatever it had left behind, it was still growing. Ezen's hands trembled as she stared at the blackened vein creeping up Igioma's throat. It pulsed faintly, like a living thing. Igioma lifted weak fingers, tracing the strange mark on her skin. Her face was twisted in confusion and fear. What is this? Anakai knelt beside her, his eyes grave. He reached out, pressing his fingertips lightly against the darkened vein. The moment he touched it, a cold wind rushed through the village square. The torches flickered and some villagers gasped. Anakai's eyes flashed white for a brief second, then he yanked his hand away, his face pale. This is not over, he murmured. Ezen's stomach clenched. What do you mean? Anakai rose slowly, gripping his staff. The spirit we banished was only a fragment of something greater. It left Igioma's body, but... He exhaled sharply. It left something behind. A seed of darkness. A curse. A murmur swept through the villagers. A curse. Dike repeated, his jaw tightening. Can it be removed? Anakai's silence was answer enough. Igioma struggled to sit up, panic flashing in her eyes. No, she whispered. I won't be like him. I won't become. She trailed off, her breath coming faster. Ezen grabbed her hands. You won't. We'll fight this. Anakai's expression darkened. If we do not act quickly, the darkness will spread. It will take root. And when it does... He looked at Igioma with deep sorrow. You will no longer be yourself. Igioma's breath hitched. Ezen tightened her grip. Then we find a way to stop it. Dike nodded sharply. Tell us what must be done. Anakai hesitated, then turned his gaze toward the distant hills, where the dense jungle loomed beyond the village. There is only one way, he said. We must seek out the keepers of the old ways. The ones who understand curses like this. Ezen followed his gaze. Beyond those trees lay the forbidden lands. Lands few returned from. And yet, if they wanted to save Ijeoma, they would have to go. The villagers stood frozen, their eyes shifting between Anakai and the distant jungle beyond the village. Whispers of fear rippled through the crowd. The forbidden lands, one elder muttered. No one who enters returns the same, if they return at all. Ezen swallowed hard. She had heard the stories. Spirits, curses, and things that walked between the worlds. Yet, as she looked at Ijeoma, weak, trembling, her skin now cold to the touch, she knew there was no other choice. If there's even a chance to save her, she said, her voice firm, then we must go. Dyke nodded sharply. I will go with you. Anakai gripped his staff, his expression unreadable. This journey is not one to take lightly. The keepers of the old ways do not welcome strangers. They will test us before they offer aid, if they offer it at all. Ezen set her jaw. Then we'll pass their tests. Ijeoma tried to sit up, but winced as a shiver racked her body. Her fingers curled around Ezen's hand, her grip weak. Don't leave me behind. Anakai studied her for a moment before nodding. She must come. The curse is within her, only she can prove her will to fight it. The village elder, Odafe, stepped forward, his face lined with worry. If you go, take caution. Many have ventured into the forbidden lands, but few have returned whole. Ezen exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. We leave at dawn. The decision had been made. And so, as the first rays of morning light touched the village, Ezen, Dyke, Anakai, and Ijeoma stepped beyond the borders of their home. Ahead of them, the thick jungle loomed, its depths hiding ancient secrets and unknown dangers. Whatever lay within would test them to their very souls. And the price of failure would be far worse than death. If you like my stories, follow, share, subscribe, like and comment for the next part as the story gets interestingly hot.